Marcus Whitmore didn't knock. That was the first thing Evelyn Harper noticed when the door of her family bakery swung open hard enough to rattle the glass in its frame. The man didn't knock, didn't hesitate, didn't even look at her when he walked in. He looked at the walls, at the shelves, at the hand-painted sign above the counter that her father had made the summer she turned 12, the one that read Harper's Bakery, Eston 1871. The letters slightly uneven because her father had never been much of a painter, but had been stubborn enough to try anyway. Marcus looked at that sign the way a man looks at something he's already decided to take. "You're behind," he said. Not a question. Evelyn was 23 years old and had been running the bakery alone for 4 months, since her father's chest gave out on a Tuesday morning in February while he was carrying a sack of flour up from the cellar. She had been managing the debts, the supply orders, the early mornings, and the customers who sometimes paid and sometimes didn't. She knew the numbers better than Marcus did. She knew exactly how behind she was. "I'll have it by end of month," she said. Marcus finally looked at her. He was a broad man in an expensive coat, the kind of coat that told you he'd never had to wonder whether he could afford a coat. His face was pleasant in the way that certain dangerous things are pleasant, smooth, unhurried, giving nothing away. "End of month was last month," he said. "I meant this month." "Miss Harper." He said her name the way you'd say mistake. "Your father was a man I respected. He kept his word. I gave him terms I wouldn't give anyone else in this county because I respected him. But your father is gone, and I don't extend the same courtesy to—" He paused. Let the pause do the work he didn't want to do out loud. "To what?" she asked. "Go ahead and say it." He didn't say it. He just set a piece of paper on the counter between them, smoothed it flat with 2 fingers, and stepped back. It was a notice of foreclosure. 30 days. Evelyn's hands didn't shake. She was proud of that later. In the moment, she was too stunned to feel anything except a strange, ringing quiet, like the silence after a rifle shot. "You can't do this," she said. "I already did," Marcus said. And he walked out. Didn't close the door behind him. She stood at the counter for a long time after he left, listening to the wind push through the open door, watching the street outside where nobody had noticed, where the town of Ravenwood, Wyoming, went on about its morning the way it always did. Wagons rattling past, men on horseback, women walking with baskets hooked over their arms, children running between legs like water finding the lowest ground. Nobody stopped. Nobody saw the notice on the counter. Nobody saw her. That was the moment everything changed. Not the moment she decided to fight. That came later, came slowly, came at a cost she didn't yet understand. But the moment that would define everything that followed, standing in her dead father's bakery while the door swung open on its hinge, watching a powerful man walk away from the wreckage he'd made without once looking back. If you've ever been that invisible, you already know what this story is about. If you haven't, stay with it. Because what happens next will change the way you see ordinary people entirely. And if this story already has your heart beating a little faster, hit that subscribe button before we go any further. Every week I bring you stories just like this one. Stories about people who were pushed down and got back up anyway. About the kind of courage that doesn't look like courage until it's already won. Leave a comment below and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to know how far these stories travel. Now let's go back to Evelyn Harper. Back to Ravenwood, Wyoming. Back to the beginning. The summer her father died, Evelyn Harper learned that grief and poverty arrive together. They are not polite about it. They don't wait for you to finish mourning before they start demanding. They show up at the same time on the same morning, and they both want to be first. Thomas Harper had been a careful man. Not a wealthy one, careful. He kept records in a leather notebook with his initials pressed into the cover, and the record showed a bakery that walked the line between surviving and failing without ever quite crossing into either. He had debts, but they were managed. He had creditors, but they were the kind who'd known him 20 years and were willing to wait an extra week when the flour prices climbed. He had a reputation in Ravenwood that was worth something, even when the cash wasn't there. What he didn't have was a plan for dying. Evelyn found the notebook the morning after the funeral, sitting on the small desk in the back room where her father had done his bookkeeping by lamplight every Sunday evening. She sat down with a cup of coffee that went cold while she read through it, page by careful page, following the columns of numbers her father had kept in his slanted handwriting. The picture the notebook painted was not a good one. There was a loan from Marcus Whitmore, a private arrangement made 5 years earlier when a bad winter had wiped out half the bakery's supply stock. Her father had borrowed against the property itself. The terms were structured in a way that Evelyn, who was sharp with numbers but had no legal training, couldn't fully parse, but the bottom line was clear enough. If payments fell behind by more than 60 days, Whitmore had the right to move on the property. They were already 70 days behind, her father had known. He'd written in the margin, in smaller letters than usual, "We'll speak to M.W. this week. He is a reasonable man." Thomas Harper had died on a Tuesday before he got the chance to speak to anyone. Evelyn spent 3 days trying to figure out if there was something she'd missed, some arrangement her father had made that she didn't know about, some agreement that would buy her more time. She wrote a letter to Marcus Whitmore. She was careful with the language, respectful, direct, honest about the situation. She explained that her father's death had created a temporary disruption and that she was committed to managing the debt. She asked for a 60-day extension. The letter came back unopened, not returned, just sent back, the seal still intact, her own handwriting on the front staring up at her from her kitchen table like an accusation. She went to his office in person. His secretary, a young man in wire-rimmed glasses, told her Mr. Whitmore was unavailable. She went back the next day. Same answer. And the day after. On the fourth day, she stopped going. She decided that if Marcus Whitmore wouldn't speak to her, she would learn to speak louder. She opened the bakery the morning after receiving his refusal. She'd been open every morning since her father died, not because she expected to make enough to solve the debt, but because closing felt like surrender, and she wasn't ready for that. She built the fires before dawn, the way her father had taught her, the way his father had taught him. She mixed the dough with the same recipes her mother had written down in pencil on index cards that were now soft and brown with handling. She set the loaves in the oven and waited for the heat to do its slow, patient work. Some mornings, she was the only one there. Ravenwood was not a cruel town, exactly. It was a practical town, which can sometimes be worse. People there respected success and were suspicious of failure, not out of meanness, but out of the hard mathematics of frontier life. If your neighbor was failing, it was sometimes safer to keep your distance, in case failure was contagious. Evelyn had watched it happen to other families. Now it was happening to her. The customers who had come in every morning during her father's time still came in, some of them. Old Mrs. Garland, who bought a small white loaf every Tuesday and had been doing so since before Evelyn was born. The Dunmore brothers, who stopped in on their way to the lumberyard and always ordered the same thing, 2 sweet rolls, 1 coffee, 1 argument about who was paying. A few of the women from the church circle, though they came with that particular look of sympathetic concern that Evelyn was beginning to find harder to tolerate than open hostility. But the newer customers drifted away. The families who had started coming in over the past few years, the ones who hadn't known Thomas Harper personally and had no loyalty that would survive inconvenience. They went to Harkin's General Store, which had started selling bread baked somewhere else, and brought in on the morning wagon. Nothing special, nothing worth crossing town for, but cheaper and easier and carrying none of the complicated weight of supporting a young woman everyone expected to fail. Evelyn watched her customer list shrink and kept baking anyway. She told herself it was stubbornness. She told herself it was her father's daughter refusing to roll over. She told herself a lot of things in those early mornings when the bakery was dark and quiet and smelled of yeast and wood smoke, and it was just her and the work and the particular loneliness of knowing you were fighting something you might not be able to win. She didn't let herself think about what would happen if she lost. The annual Frontier Market came in the 3rd week of June, the same as it always had. It was the biggest trading day of the summer. Merchants from 3 counties, farmers selling surplus, craftspeople with their goods spread out on tables in the main street, families arriving from homesteads a full day's ride away. Her father had always set up a table. She decided she would too. She spent 2 days baking, everything she had supplies for: bread loaves, cinnamon rolls, apple pies, dried fruit pastries, honey cakes. She ran the numbers and knew the supplies were costing her money she didn't have, but she also knew the market was the one opportunity she had to get in front of people who hadn't already made up their minds about her. She arrived before the sun was up. The main street of Ravenwood was already alive with the low noise of vendors setting up, wheels on gravel, canvas snapping in the early wind, men calling to each other across the street in that particular half-shout of a crowd warming up. Evelyn found the space she'd been assigned at the end of the main row, the last table before the street turned toward the livery. It was not the worst spot, but it was close. The good spaces, the ones near the center of the market where the foot traffic ran heaviest, had already been claimed by the established merchants. Connolly Hardware, Donahue's Dry Goods, the Whitmore Trading Company, which had a full canvas booth and a sign painted in 3 colors and 2 hired men working the table. She didn't let her eyes linger on that one. She set up her table, arranged the breads and pastries the way she'd watched her father do it, height in the back, colors in the front, nothing crowded. She put the cinnamon rolls where the smell would carry. She straightened the cloth on the table and stood behind it and waited. The market filled. People moved up and down the street in the slow, browsing way of a summer crowd, stopping, looking, moving on. Children pulled at their parents' hands. Men stood with their thumbs hooked in their belts and argued about prices. Women held bolts of fabric up to the light. The noise built gradually from low murmur to full, rolling din. Nobody stopped at Evelyn's table. Not at first. Not for a long time. She watched families walk past without turning their heads. She watched a man stop 3 tables down to buy a jar of preserves, then walk past her bread without a glance. She watched a woman she recognized from the church circle look directly at her table, then look away and keep walking, and she couldn't tell if it was deliberate or just the careless indifference of someone already thinking about the next thing. After 2 hours, she had sold 3 loaves and a single pie. She had enough supplies laid out to represent most of a week's income if she sold everything. At this rate, she would go home with 80% of it and a deficit that would bring the bakery to its knees by the end of the month. She heard the whispers. They weren't even quiet about it. 2 women standing close enough that Evelyn could have touched them if she'd reached past the edge of her table, talking in the half-muffled voices people use when they want to be overheard. Thomas Harper's girl. Poor thing. Been trying to keep that bakery going since he passed. She should just sell it. Before Whitmore takes it, I heard he already sent a notice. Well, some people don't know when to quit. Evelyn didn't look at them. She rearranged a row of cinnamon rolls that didn't need rearranging. Her jaw was tight enough that she could feel it in her back teeth, but her hands were steady, and her face gave nothing away, and she kept standing there with her shoulders square because she had decided, sometime in the dark and early that morning, driving the wagon through the empty streets, that whatever happened today, she was not going to make it easy for anyone to feel sorry for her. She thought about her father. Thomas Harper had stood at this same market for 23 years. He'd had bad years. Years when he came home with half of what he'd brought. Years when the weather killed the foot traffic and the prices were wrong and the whole day felt like a failure. He'd come home from those days quieter than usual, and he'd sit on the porch for a while before dinner, and then he'd come inside and eat and talk and be himself again. He never said much about the hard days, but he never stopped showing up. The work is the work, he used to say. You do it whether it's going well or not. That's the whole thing. She straightened her back, took a breath of morning air that smelled of dust and horses and someone's coffee from somewhere nearby. And then she heard hoofbeats, not the ordinary sound of horses moving through a market. This was different, slower, deliberate. The sound of an animal being ridden by someone who wasn't in a hurry because they didn't need to be. She looked up without meaning to. The man riding in from the north end of the street was not someone she recognized immediately. He was tall in the saddle, not just height, but the particular ease of a man who'd spent so many years on horseback that the horse and the man had reached some private agreement about how to move through the world together. He wore a dark coat, good quality, but not new, the kind that had been worn in and broken down until it fit the way a second skin fits. His hat was pushed back slightly, which was how she could see his face even from a distance. He was older than she'd expected, somewhere in his mid-40s, she guessed, with the weathered look of a man who'd worked outdoors his whole life. Not handsome in the way of portraits, handsome in the way of something that had been tested and held. He rode slowly down the main street, looking at the market the way you look at something you've seen many times but never quite stopped seeing. His horse was a dark bay, enormous, the kind of animal that costs more than most people's houses, and it moved through the crowd without spooking, which said something about both the horse and the man on its back. People watched him. That was the first thing she noticed, the way people turned. Not staring exactly, but tracking. The way you track something you're aware of at the edge of your field of vision. She didn't know who he was. He reached the end of the main row, and his horse slowed to a stop. He looked at her table. He looked at her bread. She met his eyes because she always met people's eyes. Because her father had told her it was the only honest thing you could do with a stranger. Look at them directly and let them decide who you were from the truth of your face rather than what they expected to see. He dismounted, tied his horse to the post at the edge of the street, walked to her table. "Morning," he said. "Morning." He looked at the cinnamon rolls. "You make these?" "Every one of them." He picked one up and she watched him weigh it in his hand the way someone who knows what they're looking at examines quality before they commit. Then he took a bite. The market kept moving around them. The noise, the crowd, the hot summer air. But Evelyn was watching his face, because you can always tell. People who don't care about food eat without changing expression. People who care show it in the eyes. Something shifts there. Some small involuntary recognition, as if the body is acknowledging something the mouth already knew. He stopped chewing for just a second. Then he took another bite. "What's your name?" he said when he'd finished. "Evelyn Harper. My father ran Harper's Bakery on Mill Street for 23 years. I run it now." He looked at her in a way she wasn't used to. Not the practiced assessment of men deciding whether she was worth their attention. Not the patronizing sympathy of people waiting for her to confirm their expectations. He looked at her the way you look at something that surprises you, and you're honest enough to show it. "William Sterling," he said. She knew the name. Everyone in the county knew the name. Sterling Ranch, 40,000 acres northeast of town, one of the largest cattle operations in Wyoming Territory. The man had started with 100 head of cattle and $100 15 years ago and had built something most people would call a dynasty, though he probably wouldn't use that word. She didn't show that she knew. "Mr. Sterling," she said, "what can I get you?" He bought the cinnamon rolls. All of them. The full tray, 12 rolls at the price she'd marked, no haggling. Then he looked at the bread and bought 3 loaves. Then he stood at her table for a moment, not leaving, looking at the pies lined up in the back. "The apple ones," she said. "Those are better than they look." "That's so." "My mother's recipe. She put cardamom in with the cinnamon. Most people don't do that. Most people don't know what they're missing." He bought 2 pies. Then he didn't leave. He stood there for a moment with his arms full of things she'd made, looking at her table, looking at the crowd that had been moving past all morning without stopping, and something passed through his expression that she couldn't quite read. "You've been here since before sunrise," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "And business has been steady," she said, "because some lies are just pride in a different hat." He looked at her steadily. "Miss Harper," he said, "I have a proposition for you. It's going to sound strange, and I'm going to ask you to hear it out before you answer." She waited. "I've been looking for someone to run the kitchen operation at Sterling Ranch. Not cook, manage. Oversee the supply orders, coordinate meals for the crew, maintain the inventory, plan for the week. The woman I had doing it left in March, and I haven't found anyone since. I've had 3 cowboys taking turns burning things and wasting supplies, and I'm losing money every week. The situation stays the way it is." He paused. "I've been to every established cook and household manager in Ravenwood and the 2 towns north. Either they want more than I'm willing to pay for the wrong reasons, or they don't have the management skills I need, or they look at 40 cowboys and decide they'd rather be somewhere quieter." She looked at him carefully. "And you think I do have the management skills?" "I think," he said, "that anyone who can bake a cinnamon roll that good in a bakery that's clearly running on not much and still show up to this market and stand here all morning without falling apart probably knows something about running a tight operation under pressure." It was the most perceptive thing anyone had said to her in 4 months. She wanted to say yes immediately. That was the first instinct, the relief of it, the lifeline of it, the possibility it represented. She had been fighting alone for so long that the simple offer of help from someone who could actually provide it felt like the first solid ground she'd touched in months. But she was her father's daughter. She thought before she spoke. "My bakery," she said. "What about it?" "I'm not walking away from it. I have debts and an ongoing situation, and I'm not prepared to just close the doors because someone offers me a position." He nodded slowly. "I'm not asking you to close it." "Then what are you asking?" "I'm asking you to come out to the ranch during the week, 5 days. You can keep your bakery running on weekends or evenings, or however you want to arrange it. The pay is enough that you'll be able to catch up on whatever you're behind on in about 2 months, if you're careful. She thought about the foreclosure notice, about the letter she'd sent that came back unopened, about Marcus Whitmore walking out of her bakery without closing the door. How do you know what I'm behind on? He was quiet for a moment. I don't, he said. I was speaking in general terms, but… He paused. I knew your father, not well. He sold me bread for 3 years when I was getting the ranch established. He was a good man. I heard he passed. Evelyn looked at the street for a moment, looked at the crowd that had been walking past her table all morning. Yes, she said. He was. They stood in silence for a moment, not the uncomfortable kind, but the kind that happens between people who are each deciding something. What happens, she said finally, if the crew doesn't accept me? They don't have to accept you. They have to eat the food. That's not what I mean. I know what you mean. He shifted the pies under his arm. I run my ranch and I make the decisions about who's there and what their role is. What my crew thinks about those decisions is their own business. What they do about it is mine. It was a strange comfort, not a promise that it would be easy, which would have been a lie, but a promise that she wouldn't be abandoned in the middle of it. She had heard enough empty reassurances in the past 4 months to recognize the difference between what people said and what they actually meant. This felt, oddly, like what he actually meant. 1 month, she said. What? Give me 1 month to prove it works. After a month, if either of us thinks it's not the right arrangement, we end it with no debt on either side. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read. Then something moved at the corner of his mouth that might have been the beginning of a smile. Fair, he said. They didn't shake on it. She wasn't sure why. She thought about it later and still couldn't explain it. It just felt like the kind of agreement that didn't need ceremony, like something that was already decided. He left with her bread and her pies and her cinnamon rolls, and after he was gone, she stood at her table for a long moment in the noise and heat of the market. Then she started packing up. Not because she was done. She had pastries and 2 more loaves left, but because she needed a few minutes away from the crowd, away from the eyes and the whispers and the practiced invisibility of 100 people who had walked past her table without stopping. She needed to think. She thought about her father, about the notebook with the careful columns and the margin note. We'll speak to M.W. this week. He is a reasonable man. Thomas Harper had believed in people. He had believed that directness and honesty and quality work would eventually be recognized, that the world was basically fair if you were patient enough, that the Ravenwoods of the world would eventually see what was right in front of them. He had also, she now knew, been wrong about Marcus Whitmore. She wasn't sure she believed the world was basically fair. 4 months of running a failing bakery in a town that had largely stopped noticing her had done something to that belief. Not destroyed it, but bent it into a different shape, something more complicated and less comfortable. But she believed in the cinnamon rolls. She believed in the fact that William Sterling, who could have had breakfast anywhere, had taken a bite of her baking and stopped. She believed in the way he'd looked at her, not at her circumstances or her difficulties or her youth or her gender, but at her. Whatever he'd seen there, he'd decided it was worth a proposition. She wasn't sure she trusted him completely. You didn't trust a man you'd met 20 minutes ago in the middle of a market, no matter how steady his eyes were or how much he'd paid for your bread. Trust was something that built over time with evidence, and she didn't have evidence yet. But she was going to go. She was going to go because she had 30 days before Marcus Whitmore could take her father's bakery, and because William Sterling had offered her a way to fight that she hadn't been able to find on her own, and because standing at the end of the market row for the rest of her life while the crowd walked past was a kind of slow defeat she wasn't willing to accept. She would go. She would prove it worked, and then she would figure out what came next. She was packing the last of the unsold bread into the wagon when she heard footsteps behind her and turned to find a boy, 12 or 13, with red hair and the particular freckled, sunburned look of a child who spent all his time outdoors, standing at the edge of her table. "Are those cinnamon rolls?" he asked, pointing at the half-covered tray. "What's left of them?" she said. He looked at them with the uncomplicated longing of someone whose stomach was making decisions without consulting the rest of him. "How much for one?" She looked at him. He had the look of a boy whose pockets were either empty or close to it. She handed him one. "On the house," she said. He took it with both hands and ate it in approximately 3 bites, standing right there, and the expression on his face was exactly what she needed to see right then. The simple, uncomplicated satisfaction of something that was exactly as good as it smelled. "That's really good," he said, with his mouth still partially full. "I know," she said. He ran off. She finished loading the wagon. On the drive back through town, she passed the Whitmore Trading Company booth, the 3-color sign, the 2 hired men, the full setup of a man who'd never had to wonder whether anyone would stop. She kept her eyes on the road ahead and her hands steady on the reins. 30 days. She could do a lot in 30 days. Sterling Ranch was northeast of town, a ride she'd heard about but never made. She would make it Monday morning. She would walk into whatever she found there, and she would not apologize for arriving, and she would not make herself smaller to fit inside someone else's idea of who she was supposed to be. She would bring the cardamom and cinnamon recipe. She would start with the thing she knew best and build from there. And whatever Marcus Whitmore thought he'd decided about her future, he was going to find out that the notice he'd left on her counter was not the last word in the story of Evelyn Harper. Not even close. The wagon turned off the main road and she drove the rest of the way home in the long golden light of a Wyoming afternoon, and for the first time in 4 months the quiet didn't feel like emptiness. It felt like the moment before something starts. She didn't sleep much the night before she was supposed to ride out to Sterling Ranch. That wasn't unusual. She hadn't been sleeping well since February, since the Tuesday morning she'd come downstairs to find her father sitting against the cellar wall with the flour sack still in his hands, and the particular stillness about him that told her before her mind could form the words. Sleep had become something she negotiated with rather than something that came naturally, and most nights she lay awake for a long stretch in the dark, running numbers or running over conversations or running through the list of things she needed to do the next day, until finally her body gave up arguing and pulled her under for a few hours before dawn. That Sunday night she lay awake and thought about what she was walking into. She knew almost nothing about Sterling Ranch beyond its reputation, which in Ravenwood amounted to large, successful, and run by a man who didn't explain his decisions to anyone. She'd heard fragments over the years, the kind of sideways information that accumulated in a small town without anyone deliberately spreading it. That William Sterling had built the operation himself, starting with land most people considered too exposed and terrain most considered too rough. That he ran a crew of somewhere between 30 and 50 men depending on the season. That he was not known as a cruel employer but was known as an exacting one, the kind of man who expected a full day's work in exchange for a full day's pay and didn't find that arrangement particularly complicated. What she didn't know was what the crew would make of her. She turned over in the dark and looked at the ceiling. She'd told herself in the wagon on the way home that she wouldn't apologize for arriving. She still meant it, but meaning something and being prepared for the reality of it were 2 different things. And she was honest enough with herself to know that walking into a working ranch full of men who hadn't asked for her and didn't know what to do with her was going to require more than resolve. It was going to require patience she sometimes struggled to find and a willingness to be underestimated without letting it make her careless. She thought about Marcus Whitmore. 28 days now, by her count. That was what she had before the 30 days he'd given her expired. She'd spent 2 days after the market going back through her father's notebook trying to find anything she'd missed, any arrangement, any alternative, any number that looked better than the ones she'd already run. There wasn't one. The debt to Whitmore was real, and it was the kind of real that didn't leave room for negotiation, and the only question was whether she could generate enough income in time to make a meaningful payment that would give her grounds to contest the foreclosure. William Sterling's offer was, as far as she could see, the only viable answer to that question, which meant she needed Monday to go well, which meant she needed to sleep. She closed her eyes and made herself think about bread instead, the particular rhythm of mixing dough, the specific warm weight of it under her hands, the way the kitchen smelled in the first hour of baking when everything was possible and nothing had gone wrong yet. It was the only thing that reliably quieted her mind. She was asleep before she finished the thought. She was on the road before sunrise. The ride northeast from Ravenwood took about an hour and a half at a steady pace, across the kind of Wyoming landscape that was beautiful in the specific, indifferent way of things, that didn't care whether you found them beautiful or not. Wide grassland rolling in long, slow waves under a sky that was just beginning to separate from dark into the gray rose of early morning, the air cool enough that she could see her horse's breath, The road nothing but two-wheel ruts worn into the ground by years of wagons making the same trip. She'd packed a bag with her work clothes, her recipe cards, her mother's small notebook of measurements and proportions. She'd also packed, as an afterthought, a tin of cinnamon rolls she'd made that morning at 4 a.m. because she needed her hands to be doing something while she thought, and because arriving with nothing felt wrong. Sterling Ranch appeared on the horizon in the way large things appear, not all at once, but gradually, element by element, until you realized you'd been looking at it for some time without registering what it was. First the windmill, then the fence lines running straight across the grass, then the main barn, then the cluster of buildings that made up the working core of the operation. And finally, as she came over the last rise, the house itself. She'd expected something large. She hadn't expected something that looked like it had been built to last a century. It was a two-story structure of dark timber and stone, wide-porched, solid, the kind of building that communicated permanence without making a fuss about it. It sat in the middle distance with a practical plainness that she found, oddly, more impressive than something showy would have been. Showy things were trying to convince you. This just was. A man was leaning against the fence near the main gate when she rode up. Mid-30s, lean, with the squinting watchfulness of someone used to sizing things up at a distance. He pushed off the fence as she approached. "You'd be Miss Harper," he said. Not a question. "I would." Pete Callahan, foreman. He looked at her horse, then at her, with the particular measured expression of a man deciding how much he was going to say. "Mr. Sterling said to expect you. I'll show you the kitchen." He turned and walked without waiting for her to dismount, which told her something. She tied her horse at the post and followed. The kitchen was at the back of the main house, accessible through a side door that opened into a long room with 2 wood stoves, 3 work tables, shelving along 2 walls, and a large window that looked out toward the eastern pasture. It was a good space, the right size for what it needed to do, with enough natural light and enough room to move without people running into each other. It was also a disaster. The shelves were disorganized in a way that was almost impressive. Items stacked without system, supplies mixed with tools, sacks of flour and cornmeal shoved in wherever they'd fit without any apparent logic. One of the stoves had a grate that wasn't sitting right. The work tables had accumulated the residue of weeks of careless use. A barrel near the door that should have held clean water held something she chose not to examine too closely. Pete Callahan stood in the doorway, watching her take it in. "3 men been sharing the cooking since March," he said. "Hicks mostly, and Tanner when Hicks is on the far pasture. Neither of them was bred for it." "How many men am I cooking for?" 38 at peak season. 26 right now, with the summer crew not yet arrived. 2 meals a day, breakfast at 5:30, dinner at 6. Lunch they manage in the field. She walked to the shelving and pulled out a sack of flour. Checked the date on the label, then opened it and looked inside. "This has been open how long?" she asked. "Couldn't say." She pulled out the next one. Same situation. She found a sack of cornmeal at the back of the lowest shelf that had something living in it. "I'll need the full inventory of what's here before I can order supplies," she said. "And I'll need someone to help me carry that barrel out." He was quiet for a moment. "You're not going to ask about the budget?" "I'll ask Mr. Sterling about the budget. I'm asking you about the barrel." Something shifted in Pete Callahan's expression. Not warmth, exactly, but the slight adjustment of a man recalibrating his initial read. He didn't say anything. He went and got someone to help with the barrel. William Sterling found her 40 minutes later, standing on a step stool reorganizing the upper shelves, with a list of supply needs already covering both sides of a sheet of paper she'd found in her bag. "Miss Harper," he said from the doorway. "Mr. Sterling." She didn't get down from the stool. "I need to talk to you about your supply budget and your vendor arrangements, and I need you to tell me if there's a system that's been used before or if I'm starting from nothing." "Starting from nothing," he said. "My last kitchen manager had a system, but she took it with her." "All right." She handed him the list. "This is what needs to be ordered this week. I've marked the urgent items. The flour situation is a problem, and the cornmeal needs to be thrown out entirely. I'll work with what's usable for today and tomorrow, but if the supply order doesn't happen by Wednesday, we'll be short by Thursday." He looked at the list. "You've been here 40 minutes. I've been here 43 minutes. He looked at her with that same unreadable expression from the market, the one that might have been the beginning of a smile or might have been something else entirely. Pete gave you a hard time? Pete did his job, she said. He was careful. That's appropriate. She climbed down from the stool and looked at him directly. I want to be straightforward with you about something. I can run this kitchen, and I can run it well. But the first 2 weeks are going to be adjustment for everyone, including me. And during that time, your crew is going to be looking for reasons to decide I don't know what I'm doing. Some of those reasons will be real, and some of them won't. And I'd like to know now whether you're going to wait until they bring you a complaint before you consider it, or whether you're going to bring those complaints directly to me first. He was quiet for a moment. Directly to you, he said. Good, she said. Now, breakfast for 26 men in approximately, she looked at the window, estimated the light, 4 hours. What does a normal breakfast look like? Normally, he said, it looks like whatever Hicks managed not to burn. Then tomorrow it'll look like something else, she said. If you can get me a working stove grate before 5 a.m., I can work with the rest. The grate was replaced by 4 in the morning. She knew because she was already in the kitchen when the young ranch hand, couldn't have been more than 19, eyes still half closed with sleep, came in with the replacement part and fumbled his way through installing it while she worked around him. You don't have to be up, he said, surprised to find her there. Neither do you, she said. What's your name? Danny. Thank you, Danny. He reddened slightly and finished the job and left, and she turned back to the stoves, which were now both functional, and let herself feel the small satisfaction of that before moving on. Breakfast for 26 men at 5:30 in the morning. She'd spent part of the night planning it. Nothing elaborate, nothing that would require supplies she didn't have. Cornbread, because she'd found cornmeal that was still good. Fried salt pork, because the smokehouse behind the kitchen had a supply that was solid. Eggs from the henhouse, which Danny had told her held about 30 birds. Strong coffee, because coffee was the thing that would get her further than anything else with a room full of men who were used to things being inadequate. She'd also made a fresh batch of cinnamon rolls. Not for strategy, or not entirely for strategy. She'd made them because she'd been awake since before 3, and her hands needed work, and the kitchen was cold and smelled like long neglect, and she wanted to fill it with something that smelled like intention. She put them in the oven an hour before the men were due and let the smell do whatever it was going to do. They came in at 5:25. Not all at once. They filtered in over the span of about 10 minutes, in the way of men who'd gotten out of the habit of punctuality at meals, because punctuality hadn't been rewarded. They were a range of ages and sizes, and they had the particular studied indifference of a group that had collectively decided to reserve judgment. Nobody was overtly rude. Nobody was welcoming. They found seats at the long tables in the adjacent dining room and waited, and she could hear the low murmur of conversation through the pass-through, and she caught, without trying, fragments of it. Said she was from town. Harper's Bakery. Used to go there with my... How long you think she lasts? She kept moving. Cornbread out of the oven, sliced onto the platters. Pork on the plates. Eggs in the largest skillet she'd found, scrambled with a little cream she'd found in the cold box, seasoned with salt and pepper, taken off the heat while they were still slightly underdone because they'd finish on the plate, and there was nothing worse than rubbery eggs at 5:30 in the morning. Coffee in the large pot. She'd made it stronger than she thought was necessary, which meant it was approximately right. Danny helped her carry the platters out. He was, she discovered, the kind of boy who would do whatever you asked him if you asked him without condescension, and she filed that away. She set the platters on the tables and stepped back. The room was quiet for a moment in the way that rooms go quiet when something unexpected happens. The cinnamon rolls were in the center of each table in small baskets. She hadn't announced them. She'd just put them there. A man across the table, big-bearded, the look of someone who'd been doing hard physical work for 30 years, picked one up and looked at it the way you look at something you're not sure about. Then he took a bite, chewed, looked at the roll in his hand with a slightly different expression. Hicks, said the man next to him. How come you never made these? Because Hicks can't make those, said another voice, and there was laughter, and the tension in the room shifted. Not gone, but changed in character, softened at the edges. She didn't go out and acknowledge it. She stayed in the kitchen and listened to the sound of 30-something men eating and talking in a room that had been, by all accounts, a miserable place to take a meal for the past 3 months. And she let herself feel that particular satisfaction for exactly 1 minute before she started cleaning up. because the dinner menu needed to be planned and the supply list needed to be finalized, and she had a full day of work ahead of her. Pete Callahan came into the kitchen after the men had gone out to the day's work. He stood in the doorway. Different posture than that morning, less deliberate, more considering. He looked at the kitchen, which she'd already begun to reshape in the small ways available to her, and then he looked at her. "Tanner wants to know if there's more coffee," he said. "Pot's still on the left stove. Help yourself." He poured himself a cup and stood with it, and she could tell he had something else to say and was deciding whether to say it. "Hicks isn't going to make this easy for you," he said finally. She looked up from the shelf she was organizing. "Hicks is the one who was cooking?" "Hicks is the one who's been in charge since March. He didn't much like someone walking in and taking over." "Did he say something to you?" "Not yet. He'll say it to the other men first. That's how he works." He drank the coffee. "I'm not telling you this to scare you off. I'm telling you because Mr. Sterling asked me to be straight with you, and this is what straight looks like." She nodded. "What's Hicks actually good at?" Pete frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what does he do well on this ranch? What's his actual job when he's not in the kitchen?" "Hicks is the best rough rider on the property. He can break a horse nobody else will touch. He belongs in the field." "Then put him there," she said. "I'm not trying to take anything from him. I'm taking over a job he didn't want in the first place. If someone makes that clear to him, we might skip about 2 weeks of trouble." Pete looked at her for a long moment with that recalibrating expression she was starting to recognize. "I'll talk to him," he said. He left, and she turned back to the shelves, and she allowed herself a small exhale she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The days that followed had the particular quality of something being built under difficult conditions. Progress that was real but uneven, advancement made and then tested, small gains earned and occasionally lost. She organized the kitchen. She established the supply order system. She developed a meal schedule that was efficient enough to keep waste low and varied enough that the men stopped looking at the dining room table with preemptive resignation. She also made mistakes. On the third day, she misjudged the quantity of beef for the dinner stew and came up short, and she had to stretch it with additional potatoes and onion and hope. Nobody noticed the difference. Several men noticed. She heard about it from Danny, who had taken on the informal role of the person who told her things she needed to know. Delivered with the particular delicacy of a 19-year-old trying to be helpful without being disrespectful. On the 6th day, she got the fire too high on the left stove and burned the bottoms of an entire batch of cornbread and had to start over, which pushed dinner back by 20 minutes. 20 minutes is not long. At the end of a workday, it is an eternity. Hicks didn't say anything to her directly, but he didn't need to. His opinion traveled through the group the way opinions do in a small closed community, shading how men responded to her, adding a degree of cool reservation to interactions that might otherwise have been neutral. She caught it in small things, a conversation that stopped when she walked into a room, a question directed to Pete instead of to her when she was standing right there, a comment at the far end of the dinner table one evening that she couldn't quite hear but whose tone was unmistakable. She didn't confront it. She cooked. She made the things she knew would work, and she made them reliably, and she held the standard steady even when it would have been easier to cut corners, and she kept her expressions calm and her words professional, and she did not let anyone see that some mornings, riding out from Ravenwood in the gray pre-dawn, she was holding herself together with something closer to stubbornness than confidence. William Sterling ate dinner with his crew most evenings. Not always, not ceremonially, but often enough that it wasn't remarkable. He sat at one end of the long table, not set apart, just a man eating the same food as the men who worked for him. She watched him from the kitchen pass through sometimes, not because she was looking for reassurance, but because you learn things from watching a man in the ordinary moments of his day. He listened more than he talked. He noticed things that happened around him without making a performance of noticing. When two of the men had a disagreement at the far end of the table one evening that was starting to get something heated about it, he said 2 words she couldn't hear, and the thing deflated without drama. On the 8th evening, he came into the kitchen after dinner. She was cleaning the stoves. He stood in the doorway, the same way Pete had that first morning, and she had the sense that doorways were how the men of this ranch operated, standing at the edge of a space before deciding to enter it, waiting for permission that was usually given without words. "How are you finding it?" he asked. "The kitchen is workable now," she said. "The supply system is going to save you money by next month if the orders come in correctly." "I wasn't asking about the kitchen." She looked at him over her shoulder. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, not crowding the room, just present. Hicks is a problem, she said. I know. I told Pete I wasn't trying to take anything from him. Pete talked to him. Pete told me. Did it help? He considered. Some. She turned back to the stove and kept working. I'm not asking you to intervene. I'm telling you because you asked how I'm finding it, and that's the honest answer. I appreciate the honest answer. There was a moment of quiet, the particular evening quiet of a working ranch after the day is done, when the noise settles into the low-level sounds of animals and wind and the distant movement of men heading to the bunkhouse. Your bread, he said. The cinnamon rolls. Where did you learn that? My mother. She brought the recipe from her family. They were bakers back east, her grandmother and her grandmother before that. She's still living? No, she died when I was 11. He was quiet. My wife died 9 years ago, he said. It was said simply, the way people say things they've said enough times that they no longer need to protect the words. I'm sorry, she said. She was the one who understood the house, he said. I understand the land. I understand the cattle. The house has never quite been right since. She didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't have been smaller than the truth of it. She finished the stove and set down the cloth and turned to face him properly. Mr. Sterling, she said, I want to tell you something. He waited. I have 20 days left on a foreclosure notice. That's why I said yes at the market. I want you to know that because I don't like arrangements built on information the other person doesn't have. The debt is to Marcus Whitmore, and I believe he's moving on the property because he wants the location, not because the debt is actually beyond remedy. I intend to fight it, but I need income to fight it with. He was very still for a moment. You're telling me this because you asked how I was finding it, and the honest answer includes the fact that I'm fighting on 2 fronts, and you should know that. He looked at her for a long time. The lamp in the kitchen made the light warm and uneven, the kind of light that makes everything look slightly more serious than it might in daylight. Marcus Whitmore, he said. You know him. I know him. His voice had changed slightly. Not harder, exactly, but flatter in the way that means a thing has moved from abstract to personal. He's been trying to expand his trading operation into the Northeast Corridor for 2 years. Your father's property on Mill Street sits on the best corner in Ravenwood. She felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. He planned this. I don't know that, but I know Marcus Whitmore doesn't do anything without a reason. She sat down on the edge of the work table, not gracefully, just because her legs made the decision before she did, and looked at the floor for a moment. My father trusted him, she said. He wrote in his notebook that Whitmore was a reasonable man. Your father was a man who extended people the same good faith he operated with himself. That's a fine quality. He paused. It's also something people take advantage of. She breathed in and breathed out and thought about the foreclosure notice sitting on her counter at home, thought about the letter she'd sent that came back unopened, thought about the way Marcus Whitmore had looked at her father's sign, the slightly uneven letters, the summer her father had been so stubborn about painting it himself. I need to understand what rights I have, she said. I need to understand whether the loan terms he structured give me any legal ground. There are people who could help you with that. I can give you a name if you want one. She looked up. Why would you do that? He was quiet for a moment. Something in his face, not the careful flatness she'd been reading all week, but something underneath it, something that had to do with what he'd said about his wife and the house that had never been quite right since, something she wasn't sure she was supposed to see. Because what he did to your father was wrong, he said, and what he's doing to you is wrong. And in my experience, when wrong things are left alone, they tend to keep happening to people who don't deserve them. She looked at him for a long moment. All right, she said, I'll take the name. He gave it to her before he left the kitchen. A lawyer in Cheyenne, someone he described as competent and not easily intimidated, which she suspected was a more specific recommendation than it sounded. She wrote the name down on the back of a supply list and folded it into her apron pocket. After he was gone, she stood in the kitchen alone for a while, in the good quiet of a space that had been cleaned and organized and used properly, the stoves cooling, the smell of the day's work still in the air, and she felt something she hadn't felt in 4 months. Not hope, exactly. Hope was too light a word for what she was carrying, something more like the sensation of ground under her feet, of knowing where she stood, even if where she stood was difficult, of having, for the first time since she'd read those numbers in her father's notebook, a path forward that she could actually see. She would fight Marcus Whitmore. She would fight him with the same patience and the same stubbornness with which she'd stood at that market table while the crowd walked past, and the same precision with which she'd rebuilt this kitchen from a disaster into a functioning operation, and she would not do it alone. She went home that evening with the supply list in her pocket and the lawyer's name written on the back of it, and she fell asleep before she could start running numbers, which was the best sleep she'd had in months. The following week, Hicks came into the kitchen. It was mid-morning, the in-between hour when the breakfast cleanup was done and dinner prep hadn't fully begun. The only genuine breathing room in a kitchen day. She was working through next week's menu against the supply inventory, and she heard his footstep on the stone floor and looked up. He was a large man, broader through the chest than most, with the particular look of someone who'd spent years outdoors in all weather and had simply stopped noticing it. His expression when he came in was not hostile exactly. It was the expression of a man who had made a decision and was going to say the thing and get it over with. He stood in the middle of the kitchen and said, "That cornbread you made Thursday." She waited. "How do you get it that way?" he said. "The crust. Mine always comes out either too thick or not there at all." She looked at him for a moment. He was not comfortable asking, that was obvious. But he was asking anyway, which told her something about what kind of man he actually was under the territorial posturing of the past 2 weeks. "Cast iron," she said, "has to be preheated before the batter goes in, and butter in the pan, not lard. The lard doesn't give you the crust, it just greases it." He was quiet, processing. "That's it?" he said. "That and the temperature. Most people cook cornbread too cool, it needs the shock of the heat." He nodded slowly. Not agreement exactly. The nod of someone filing information away. "I'll try that," he said, and walked out. She stood at the work table for a moment after he left, and then she went back to her menu planning, and she didn't make anything of it out loud or to anyone else, and neither did he. And the following week, the thing that had been a problem between them became, without ceremony, something that wasn't a problem anymore. That was the week Pete Callahan started asking her opinion on the supply budget. That was the week Danny started showing up 20 minutes early to get the fires going before she arrived. That was the week the men began to come back to the kitchen door after dinner sometimes. Not for anything specific, just the way people drift back to a place where they've eaten well and felt comfortable, the way warmth draws toward warmth. She noticed all of it. She didn't remark on it. She just kept cooking. And on the 15th day, she wrote a letter to the lawyer in Cheyenne. She told him the situation plainly: the loan, the terms, the missed payments, the unopened letter, the foreclosure notice. She told him she believed the arrangement had been structured to fail, and she wanted to know if there was legal ground for that belief. She told him she had some money now and could arrange a payment if the consultation warranted it. She sealed the letter and gave it to Danny to post on his next trip to town. Then she went back to the kitchen and started the bread for the next morning, working in the late afternoon light that came through the eastern window and turned everything in the room gold for about an hour. And she thought about her father's notebook and his careful columns and his slightly uneven sign and his belief in the basic reasonableness of people. And she thought that he hadn't been entirely wrong, just wrong about the specific people he'd trusted. She intended to make better choices. She intended to earn the ground she was standing on and keep it and let no one take it from her again. The bread rose in the warmth of the kitchen and the day moved toward evening and somewhere northeast of Ravenwood. 40,000 acres of Wyoming grassland ran to the edge of the sky, and Evelyn Harper was still standing. The letter came back from Cheyenne in 11 days. She was in the kitchen when Danny brought it in, setting it on the corner of the work table without a word, the way he'd learned to deliver things that looked important, quietly, without ceremony, giving her room to decide what they meant before anyone else had an opinion about it. She finished what she was doing, wiped her hands on her apron, and picked it up. The lawyer's name was Edmund Voss. His letterhead was plain, just the name and the Cheyenne address, no flourishes, which she took as a good sign. Men who put flourishes on their letterhead were usually compensating for something. She read it standing at the work table. Voss had done some preliminary research based on the details she'd provided. The loan structure her father had entered into with Marcus Whitmore was, in his assessment, unusual in 2 specific ways. First, The acceleration clause, the provision that allowed Whitmore to call the full debt due on extended delinquency, had been triggered under terms that were narrower than standard practice, meaning the threshold for default was lower than most creditors would accept and lower than most borrowers would notice without legal training. Second, and more significantly, the property valuation used as collateral security had been assessed by a firm that Voss recognized as having a business relationship with Whitmore's trading company. In plain language, the man who decided what the bakery was worth had been working for the man who held the debt. Voss wrote, "This does not automatically constitute fraud, but it raises questions about the independence of the valuation that would be worth examining before a court. I would need to review the original loan documents before advising you further. If you can obtain copies, I recommend you do so promptly and send them to me by the earliest available post." She read the letter twice. Then she folded it and put it in her apron pocket next to the supply list she'd been working from, and she stood at the work table for a moment looking at the eastern window where the afternoon light was doing its daily hour of gold, and she felt something shift in her chest, something that had been braced for months, some posture of permanent readiness for bad news, loosening slightly at the edges. It wasn't over. It wasn't anywhere close to over. But there was something there. A crack in the wall she'd been pushing against. Small, maybe. Maybe nothing. But a crack was not nothing. She went back to work. She didn't tell William Sterling that evening, not because she was keeping it from him. She'd been straightforward with him about the situation from the night she'd explained it in this same kitchen, but because she needed to think through what it meant before she talked about it, needed to hold it privately for a little while, and turn it over and make sure she understood what she was looking at before she shared it. That was how she worked. Her father had been the same way, she realized. He'd carry a problem for days before he'd speak it out loud, turning it in his mind the way you turn an unfamiliar tool, figuring out which end was the handle. What she needed now were the original loan documents. She knew they existed. Her father had been careful about paperwork. The notebook was proof of that. She'd gone through the desk in the back room of the bakery after his death, looking for anything related to the debt, and she'd found a folder of correspondence with Whitmore, but not the original loan agreement itself. At the time, she'd assumed she'd missed it in her grief-fogged state, or that it was filed somewhere she hadn't thought to look. She'd been so focused on the numbers in the notebook that she hadn't pushed further. She needed to go back to the bakery and look again. She went on her next day away from the ranch, a Thursday, when the supply delivery was handled and the men's dinner was a cold spread she'd prepared in advance and left covered on the kitchen tables. She rode back to Ravenwood in the mid-morning, tied her horse on Mill Street, and let herself in through the front door. The bakery had the particular smell of a space that had been closed and unused. Not unpleasant, exactly, but stilled, like the air had forgotten to move. She'd been keeping up the mortgage payments on the building itself through the small income she'd managed to generate in those first months, and the space was intact, waiting. The sign above the counter with its slightly uneven letters. The counter itself, scrubbed clean, the cold ovens. She went to the back room. The desk was a large roll-top her father had bought second-hand years ago, deeply scarred with use, with a locking mechanism he'd long since lost the key to, so it was always open. She'd gone through the visible drawers the first time. Now she went through everything, lifted the writing surface, checked behind the pigeonholes, ran her hand along the underside of the middle shelf. Her fingers found an edge, a false back to the center pigeonhole, just a thin panel of wood that had been fitted so well she'd missed it entirely the first time, looking at the surface and not thinking about the depth. She worked it loose and found, folded behind it, a set of papers held together with a length of string. She carried them to the counter and laid them out in the light. The loan agreement. All of it, 5 pages in the precise legal language of an official document, signed by her father and witnessed, signed by Marcus Whitmore and witnessed. She read through it twice with the same focused attention she gave to supply inventories, tracking each clause, noting dates and figures and terms. What she found made her go very still. The acceleration clause was exactly as Voss had described, triggered at 60 days of delinquency, tighter than standard. But there was something else she hadn't known about, something her father's notebook hadn't reflected, a renewal provision. On the 5-year anniversary of the loan, which had been 4 months before her father died, the terms could be renegotiated at Whitmore's discretion with 30 days' notice. The notice her father had received would have been in late January. 3 weeks before he died. She stood at her father's counter holding 5 pages of legal language and understanding, for the first time, the full shape of what had happened. Her father had received Whitmore's renewal notice in January. He'd known that the terms were changing and that the situation was becoming dangerous. He'd written in his notebook, "We'll speak to MW this week. I's a reasonable man." And then he'd died on a Tuesday before he got the chance to speak to anyone about anything. And Marcus Whitmore had known about the notebook note. He'd known Thomas Harper had died before making that conversation happen. He'd sent the foreclosure notice 3 months later. Enough time for it to look unhurried, enough time for the 60-day delinquency clock to run its course, but not enough time for a grieving 23-year-old woman with no legal training to figure out what she was actually looking at. She wasn't sure if that was patience or cruelty. She suspected it was both. She copied the key sections of the loan document in her own handwriting, then wrapped the original pages carefully, tucked them inside her coat against her body, and walked out of the bakery. She didn't look at the Whitmore Trading Company sign on the corner as she passed it. She got on her horse and rode back northeast. She told William Sterling that evening, not in the kitchen this time. He'd found her in the yard, where she'd stopped to water her horse before going in, and something in her face or her posture had made him stop too rather than continuing toward the barn as he'd clearly been intending. "You went to town," he said. "I found the original loan documents." She told him what was in them. She was precise about it: dates, clause numbers, the renewal provision, the January timeline. He listened without interrupting, which was how he always listened, and she could see him fitting the pieces together in the same methodical way she had. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "He planned the timing," he said. It was not a question. "I think he planned everything," she said. "The renewal provision gave him the ability to change the terms whenever he wanted. He waited until my father was in a position where he couldn't easily respond, sent the notice, and then," she stopped. "I don't know if he knew my father was sick. I don't know if it matters." "It matters," William said, "but not to the legal question." "No. The legal question is the valuation." She looked at him. "You said the firm that assessed the bakery's value had a business relationship with Whitmore's Trading Company." He'd said that, or nearly that, a month ago in the kitchen, and she'd been turning it over ever since. She could see that he remembered saying it. "There's a man named Caldwell," he said. "He does assessments for half the commercial properties in this county. He also handles all of Whitmore's property acquisitions. I've known this for 2 years. Can you put that in writing?" He looked at her steadily. "Yes." She sent the loan documents and William's written statement to Voss in Cheyenne by the Friday post. She wrote a cover letter that was 3 sentences long. "Here are the documents. Here is a corroborating statement. Please advise on next steps." She didn't fill the letter with emotion or argument. The facts were the argument. They didn't need her feelings attached. Then she waited. Waiting was, she'd discovered, one of the hardest skills. Not waiting passively. She was never passive. There was always the kitchen and the supply orders and the meal planning and the slow ongoing work of running a kitchen for 38 men at peak summer capacity, because the seasonal crew had arrived in the 3rd week and the numbers had climbed and the work had gotten heavier. But the particular kind of waiting that meant holding your attention in 2 places at once, fully present in the work, fully present in the worry, that was exhausting in a specific way that sleep didn't entirely fix. She managed it by working harder. The summer crew brought new complications. They were younger, louder, less settled than the permanent hands, and they arrived with their own established habits and opinions about how things should run, including how the kitchen should be run. On the 2nd day, one of them, a tall kid from Nevada called Reese, who had the particular confidence of someone who'd never yet had a good reason to doubt himself, came into the kitchen after breakfast and helped himself to the leftover cornbread without asking, and then stood against the wall eating it while she was trying to work, making comments about whether she was planning to vary the menu at any point. She didn't turn around from the stove. "Reese," she said. He stopped mid-comment. "The kitchen is a working space. If you're not working in it, you're in the way. Take your cornbread to the dining room." Silence. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and left. Danny, who was cleaning the large skillet near the back, didn't look up or say anything, but she caught the slight movement of his shoulders that meant he was suppressing something. "Don't," she said. "I'm not doing anything," he said, and went back to scrubbing, and she could see from the back of his neck that he was absolutely smiling. The thing about the summer crew was that they settled quickly once the food made its case. That was something she'd learned in the first months at the ranch. That men doing hard physical work had a relationship with food that was direct and uncomplicated. If you fed them well and consistently, they'd follow you through most things. If you fed them badly, nothing else you did was going to compensate. She'd seen this with Hicks, with the first wave of the permanent crew, and she watched it happen again with the summer hands over the course of about a week. By the second week of July, Sterling Ranch was feeding 51 men twice a day and doing it without running over budget, which Pete Callahan told her was the first time that had been true in 4 summers. She didn't celebrate it. She noted it, filed it, moved on to the next problem. The next problem came in the 3rd week of July, when Marcus Whitmore came to the ranch. She didn't know he was there until she heard his voice. She'd learned his voice, the smooth, unhurried quality of it, the way it always sat at the same volume as if he'd calculated that exact level of projection and saw no reason to adjust for circumstances. She heard it through the kitchen wall, from the direction of the front of the house, and for a moment she stood very still with her hands on the work table and let the sound place itself in her memory. The bakery. The foreclosure notice. Your father was a man I respected. She walked to the pass-through window and looked through without showing herself. He was standing in the front room with William, both of them standing. Nobody had sat down, which told her the visit was not a social one. Whitmore had his hat in his hand in the studied manner of someone performing courtesy without actually feeling it. His expression was the same pleasant smoothness she remembered, the face of a man who kept his cards close and his voice warm. I heard you'd taken on some new staff, Whitmore was saying. Thomas Harper's girl. I didn't realize you knew the family. I didn't know the family well, William said. His voice had that particular flatness she'd heard before. The night in the kitchen, when she'd told him about the foreclosure. Miss Harper is running the kitchen operation. She's been doing it for better than a month. I see. Whitmore turned his hat slightly in his hands. It's an unusual arrangement. Most good arrangements are unusual when they start. I only mention it because there's an outstanding matter. Whitmore paused with the timing of a man who knows how to use pauses. Regarding the Harper property on Mill Street, a debt her father contracted that hasn't been resolved. I'm aware of the situation, William said. Something moved through Whitmore's expression. Small, quickly controlled, but she caught it from the pass-through. He hadn't expected that. He'd come here expecting to inform William of something the man didn't know, to position himself as simply reporting a fact, and instead he'd found that the ground had already shifted. Then you understand, Whitmore said carefully, that there are outstanding legal obligations that need to be addressed. I understand there are outstanding legal questions, William said. That's a different thing. Another pause, longer this time. William, Whitmore said, and the use of the first name was a recalibration, a shift to the register of men who know each other, who have history, who can speak plainly. I've known you a long time. I don't want there to be any misunderstanding between us. There isn't one, William said. I understand exactly what you want and why you want it. The pleasantness dropped out of Whitmore's face for just a second, just a flicker, the way a lamp dims when the wind hits it, and she saw what was underneath. Not anger, exactly. Something colder than that. That property is legitimately owed, he said. That's for a court to determine, William said. Whitmore put his hat back on. He did it the way you do something when you're buying time to decide your next move. I hope, he said finally, that you haven't put yourself in a position you'll regret. I've been putting myself in positions other people thought I'd regret for 20 years, William said. I'm still here. Whitmore left. She listened to his footsteps cross the front room, heard the door, heard his horse, heard the fading sound of him riding away. Then she heard William's footsteps coming toward the kitchen. He came in and stood in the doorway, that particular doorway posture she knew by now, and looked at her. He knew she'd heard. She didn't pretend otherwise. He'll escalate, she said. Yes. He came here to find out how much you knew. Now he knows you're involved. She looked at the work table. He's going to come at this differently now. He was going to come at it differently eventually, William said. This just moved the timeline. She thought about the letter to Voss that was still waiting for a reply. 11 days since she'd sent the documents. She'd expected to hear back within the week and hadn't. She didn't let herself read too much into the silence, but the silence was sitting on her chest now with a weight that was hard to ignore. I need to go to Cheyenne, she said. He looked at her. In person. The letter is taking too long and Whitmore is going to make his next move before Voss has had a chance to advise me on mine. I need to sit down with that lawyer and understand what my options actually are, not wait for a letter that tells me to wait for another letter. He considered. When? As soon as I can arrange the kitchen coverage. Danny can manage breakfast if I put the plan in writing. Hicks can oversee the supply delivery. 2 days. 1 to get there and meet with Voss, 1 to come back. He nodded. I'll cover the cost of the trip. I'll pay you back when… Evelyn. It was the first time he'd used her given name. It stopped her mid-sentence the way an unexpected sound stops you. Not uncomfortable, just arresting. Let me cover the cost of the trip. She looked at him. The kitchen was quiet around them, the late afternoon beginning to cool, the smell of the day's work settling into the walls. All right, she said. She went to Cheyenne 2 days later. Edmund Voss had an office on a side street 3 blocks from the territorial courthouse. Small, organized with the controlled chaos of a man who had too many cases but knew where everything was. He was shorter than she'd imagined, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and ink stains on the first 2 fingers of his right hand that suggested he worked by hand rather than delegating the writing. He stood up when she came in and shook her hand with a directness that she appreciated. Miss Harper, I was planning to write to you this week. I couldn't wait for a letter, she said, and sat down and told him so. They spent 3 hours going through it, the loan documents, William's statement about Caldwell, the timeline of the renewal notice and her father's death and the foreclosure filing. Voss asked good questions, not the kind designed to manage her expectations downward, but the kind that were actually trying to understand the shape of the thing, the kind that told her he was genuinely working the problem. At the end of 3 hours, he took off his glasses and cleaned them on his shirt and looked at her. Here's what I can tell you, he said. The valuation conflict of interest is real and documentable. The Caldwell firm's relationship with Whitmore's trading company is a matter of public commercial record. I've already confirmed it. Whether it rises to the level of fraud depends on what a judge decides about intent. And intent is always the hard part. What's your read? She asked. My read is that a man who structures a loan with a narrow acceleration clause uses his own associated assessor to value the collateral and then moves on the property within 6 months of the borrower's death did not arrive at that sequence of events by accident. He paused. But my read is not a legal argument. What is a legal argument? The conflict of interest in the valuation gives you grounds to contest the foreclosure on the basis that the original collateral determination was compromised. That's a procedural challenge. It doesn't require proving fraud, just proving that the process was flawed. A flawed process means the loan terms may not be enforceable as written. She was quiet for a moment. Is that enough to stop him? It's enough to get in front of a judge. It's enough to create a hearing, and a hearing is the thing Whitmore least wants, because a hearing is public, and Marcus Whitmore has built his entire operation on things staying private. She thought about the smooth, pleasant face, the hat turning in his hands. I only mention it because there's an outstanding matter. File it, she said. Voss looked at her steadily. Once we file, he'll respond. He has resources, and he's not going to take a procedural challenge lying down. This could get complicated. It's already complicated, she said. File it. He filed it. She rode back to Sterling Ranch the following afternoon with a copy of the filed challenge in her bag and the particular quality of exhaustion that comes not from physical effort, but from hours of sustained concentration, of holding your mind to something difficult and refusing to let it slip. The Wyoming landscape ran alongside her in its usual indifference, the grass moving in the wind, the sky enormous and empty and clean. She thought about her father. She thought about him carrying that flour sack up from the cellar on a Tuesday morning in February, carrying it the way he'd carried everything, steadily, without complaint, doing the work because the work needed doing. She thought about the notebook with his careful columns and the margin note about Marcus Whitmore being a reasonable man. He'd been wrong about Whitmore, but he hadn't been wrong about the work. She rode through the gate of Sterling Ranch in the long light of late afternoon, and Danny came out to take her horse, and the smell of dinner was already coming from the kitchen, something she'd left in Pete Callahan's instructions that morning, something simple that didn't require much judgment. She could tell from the smell that it had turned out approximately right. She went inside and washed the road off her face and stood in the kitchen and looked at the space she'd spent 6 weeks making functional and thought about what Voss had said. A hearing is the thing Whitmore least wants, because a hearing is public. She would make it public then. Whatever it cost her, whatever complicated and difficult shape it took, she would make it public. That evening, William found her in the kitchen after dinner, the same way he'd found her on the 8th evening, the same way they'd been finding each other in this kitchen for the past 6 weeks. Not by plan, just the pattern that forms between people who keep gravitating toward the same space. "How was Voss?" he said. "He filed the challenge," she said. Something moved through William's expression, something she was getting better at reading, that particular quality of carefully held emotion, the man who kept his feelings below the surface not because he didn't have them, but because he'd learned that keeping them below the surface was how you thought clearly. "Good," he said. "Whitmore is going to respond." "He will. And then there'll be a hearing." "Yes." She looked at him. The lamp in the kitchen made everything warm and slightly unreal, the way evenings in working kitchens always felt slightly separate from the rest of the day. "I want you to know," she said, "that I don't intend to let this become your problem. Whatever he does next, whatever direction he comes from, this is my fight. You've already done more than you needed to." He was quiet for a long moment. "Evelyn," he said, and she'd decided that she didn't mind, actually, the way he said her name, the plainness of it. No ceremony. "I wrote that statement about Caldwell because what Whitmore did is wrong, not because I was doing you a favor." "I know that," she said. "Then let me continue to act on it being wrong without you worrying about the debt you're running up." She opened her mouth to answer, and he looked at her with an expression she'd seen a few times before, the one that meant he'd said the thing and meant the thing and was done adding to it. She closed her mouth, nodded. "All right," she said. "Thank you." He left, and she stood in the kitchen alone for a while, and then she started prepping the morning bread the way she always did. The flour, the water, the careful work of her hands in the dough, the old familiar rhythm that her mother had taught her and her father had watched, and that had become, over years of practice, the thing she did when she needed to feel like herself. She thought about Marcus Whitmore. She thought about him coming to Sterling Ranch to find out what William knew, leaving with less certainty than he'd arrived with. She thought about him going back to his office on the corner of Mill Street and looking at her father's sign with its slightly uneven letters and calculating his next move. He was going to make one. She knew that. A man like Whitmore didn't fold on the first push. He regrouped, he redirected, he came back from an angle you hadn't guarded. But here was the thing Marcus Whitmore had not yet understood. He had spent 6 months dealing with a young woman who was alone and grieving and operating entirely on stubbornness and the desperate mathematics of survival. That woman still existed. She was still all of those things. But she was not alone anymore. She worked the dough until it was right, shaped it, covered it to rise, set the kitchen to rights for the morning crew, and walked out into the Wyoming night. The air was sharp and clean, full of the smell of grass and animals and distance. Somewhere in Cheyenne, a legal document with her name on it was sitting on a judge's desk. Somewhere in Ravenwood, Marcus Whitmore was deciding what to do about it. And here, in the dark outside a ranch that had become, without her quite noticing the moment it happened, something close to home, Evelyn Harper stood breathing the night air and let herself feel, for the first time, that she was not just surviving, she was preparing. Whitmore's response came faster than she'd expected. Voss had filed the procedural challenge on a Wednesday. By the following Monday, a counterfiling had landed at the territorial courthouse in Cheyenne. A document Voss summarized for her in a letter that arrived Thursday, written in his plain, ink-stained hand, with the particular economy of a man who respected other people's time. Whitmore's lawyers had responded on 2 fronts. The first was expected, a formal rebuttal of the valuation conflict argument, asserting that the Caldwell firm operated independently of Whitmore's commercial interests and that any business relationship between the two parties was incidental and immaterial to the assessment of the Harper property. The second front was not something she'd anticipated. They had filed a counterclaim asserting that Thomas Harper had been given full notice of the renewal terms in January, had failed to respond or make any good faith effort to renegotiate, and that his estate, which for practical purposes meant Evelyn as sole heir, bore the full obligation of the original debt plus accumulated interest and legal costs, now totaling a figure that was nearly double what the original loan had been. She read the summary at the kitchen table before the morning fires were fully going, in the gray pre-dawn with a cup of coffee she'd made too strong by habit, and she read it twice and then set it face down on the table and sat with her hands wrapped around the cup and breathed. Double. The number was designed to be crushing. She understood that immediately. It wasn't just a legal position, it was a message. It was Whitmore saying, "Look at what fighting me costs. Look at what you're choosing to carry. Walk away now, and I'll let you walk away with something. Keep going, and I'll bury you." She turned the letter face up and read it again. Her father had received the renewal notice in January. He'd written in the notebook that he intended to speak to Whitmore. He'd died before he could. The failure to respond was not bad faith, it was death. A dead man cannot negotiate a loan renewal, and an estate in the hands of a grieving daughter who didn't know the full picture of the debt until 4 months later could not reasonably be held to a response window that had closed before she knew it existed. She wrote all of this down on the back of the letter in a list, the way she worked through kitchen problems. Break it into components. Look at each component, figure out which ones have solutions, and work from there. The morning crew started filtering in. She put the letter in her apron pocket and started breakfast. She told William that evening. He was in the yard when she found him, checking the fence line near the east pasture. The kind of routine physical task that she'd noticed he did at the end of the day when he needed to think. Moving his hands on something tangible while his mind worked on something that wasn't. She walked out and told him the counterclaim, the doubled figure, the timeline argument. He listened without looking up from the fence wire. "He's trying to make the math too heavy to carry," he said. "Yes." "Is it?" She looked at the grass moving in the early evening wind. The honest answer was that she didn't know. She'd been running numbers in her head all day between the breakfast service and the dinner prep, and the honest answer was that the doubled figure was beyond anything she could manage in the near term, even with the ranch income, even with everything. "Not if the valuation argument holds," she said. "If the court agrees that the original collateral assessment was compromised, the loan terms get thrown out and we negotiate from a different starting point. Whitmore loses his legal leverage. And if the argument doesn't hold," she was quiet for a moment, "then I need to find a different way." He set down the wire tool and looked at her. The evening light was doing what it did out here, turning the grass gold and the sky that particular deep blue that happened for about 20 minutes before dark. The kind of sky that made everything look more serious than it was, or maybe exactly as serious as it was. "Voss needs something more than the Caldwell conflict," he said. "He needs testimony. Someone who can speak to the standard practice of property assessment in this county and confirm that what Caldwell did fell outside it." Voss said the same thing in the letter. "I know someone," William said. He said it the way he said most things, simply, without decoration. "A man named Garrett Hollis. He's been doing independent property assessments in Wyoming Territory for 15 years. He's testified in 3 land fraud cases that I know of. He's not cheap and he's not easy to get to agree, but if he reviews the Caldwell assessment and finds what I think he'll find, his testimony is worth more than anything else you could bring to that hearing." She looked at him. "How do you know him?" "He assessed this property when I was first establishing the ranch. He was the only assessor in the territory who told me the truth about what the land was worth instead of what I wanted it to be worth." A brief pause. "I've respected him for it ever since." "Will he talk to you?" "He'll talk to me," William said. "Whether he'll agree to review the Caldwell work is a different question. He's particular about what he takes on. But I can write to him." "Do it," she said. He wrote that night. She didn't ask to see the letter. It was his relationship and his judgment, and she'd learned in the months at this ranch that William Sterling's judgment about people was generally better than most. She trusted it. She had other things to manage. The hearing date came back from the courthouse in Cheyenne 3 days later, the second week of September, 5 weeks out. It felt like both too much time and not nearly enough, which was probably accurate. In the intervening weeks, 2 things happened that she hadn't planned for. The first was that word got out. Small towns in Wyoming Territory did not have newspapers in the way that eastern cities did, but they had something that functioned just as efficiently, the particular intelligence network of people who did business with each other, who attended the same churches and markets and county meetings, who had known each other's families for a generation. Information moved through this network with remarkable speed and surprising accuracy, and within 2 weeks of the counterclaim filing, the basic shape of the story, Thomas Harper's daughter, Marcus Whitmore, the bakery on Mill Street, the procedural challenge in Cheyenne, was known to most of the people in Ravenwood and the surrounding county. The reactions were not uniform. Some people were on Whitmore's side, or at least on the side of legal process and established debt, which amounted to the same thing practically. She heard about this through Danny, who heard things the way 19-year-old boys hear things, by being invisible in rooms where people forget to watch what they say. A few of the older merchants thought she was a foolish girl throwing good money after bad. The Whitmore Trading Company's regular customers, people with commercial relationships they didn't want to jeopardize, kept their opinions quiet, but their silence was its own message. But there were others. Old Mrs. Garland, who had bought a small white loaf every Tuesday for decades and knew the Harper family better than almost anyone in Ravenwood, went to see two other longtime customers of the bakery and told them what she thought of Marcus Whitmore and his counterclaim in terms that Danny reported to Evelyn with the slightly odd expression of someone who'd heard language they hadn't expected from that particular source. The Dunmore brothers, who'd been customers of the bakery since before Evelyn was born, made a point of coming to visit her at the ranch one Sunday afternoon, not to do anything specific, just to sit at the kitchen table and drink coffee and let her know they hadn't forgotten whose bread had fed them for 20-odd years. She hadn't expected that. She sat across from the two of them, big men, loud men, the kind who argued about everything as a form of affection, and felt something she'd been holding at arm's length for months move closer. Not sentimentality exactly, something more structural than that, more like the feeling of a building settling onto its foundation. "Your father would have handled this differently," the older Dunmore said. He was not saying it as a criticism. He was saying it as a statement of fact about who Thomas Harper had been. "He would have tried to talk to Whitmore," she said. "He would have tried 3 times before he accepted it wasn't going to work," the younger Dunmore said. "That was Tom. He believed in people longer than most." "Too long," the older one said. "Maybe," the younger one said, "but it's not the worst thing, being the person who believes in people too long." She thought about that after they left. Thought about her father at his desk on Sunday evenings with his notebook and his careful columns, trusting the numbers to tell the truth if he was honest enough with them. He hadn't been wrong about the importance of honesty. He'd just been wrong about who else was practicing it. She was going to be honest. She was going to be honest in a courtroom in front of a judge, in a county where Marcus Whitmore had been building his influence for 15 years, with a lawyer she'd hired with borrowed money and an expert witness she hadn't yet confirmed. And she was going to lay out the facts of what had been done to her father and let those facts do the work her father had believed facts should do. The second unexpected thing was harder. In the last week of August, 2 weeks before the hearing, Whitmore moved against the bakery directly. He filed a supplementary action with the county recorder's office. Not the Cheyenne court, but the local office. A procedural maneuver that Voss later explained was designed to create a parallel pressure track. Under the supplementary action, the property on Mill Street was flagged as being in disputed collateral status, which meant that she could not legally sell it, rent it, or use it as security for any further borrowing until the Cheyenne matter was resolved. It didn't take anything from her that she currently had, but it closed every door she might have used to raise additional funds while the hearing was pending. She understood what it meant. If the hearing went badly, if the valuation argument didn't hold, if Garrett Hollis couldn't confirm his assessment in time, if Voss's procedural challenge failed, she would have no remaining options. The bakery would go to Whitmore in its entirety, and she would have nothing to show for 7 months of fighting except a debt that had doubled in the fighting. She was in the kitchen when the notice of the supplementary action arrived, delivered by the county writer on a Thursday afternoon. She read it at the work table, and then she set it down and stood very still for a moment, looking at the far wall of the kitchen, at the organized shelves that had been a disaster when she'd arrived and were now the way she'd made them. Ordered, logical, everything in its place. She thought about leaving. She let herself think about it clearly and honestly, the way she tried to think about everything. She could stop. She could write to Voss and tell him to withdraw the challenge, accept whatever settlement terms Whitmore's lawyers would offer, take whatever was left, probably nothing, and start again from somewhere else. She was 23 years old. Starting from nothing was something young people could do, technically. It was possible. The thought lasted about 45 seconds before she knew exactly what she was going to do with it. She folded the notice of supplementary action and put it with the other documents in the folder she kept in the locked box under her bed, In the small room William had given her when it became clear that riding back and forth from Ravenwood every day was a waste of time she didn't have. She went back to the stove and finished what she'd been doing. That evening she wrote to Voss. She told him about the supplementary action. She told him she wanted it included in the hearing record as an example of ongoing pressure tactics. She told him she wasn't withdrawing and she wasn't settling, and she wanted to know if Garrett Hollis had confirmed. Hollis had confirmed. William told her the following morning. Came into the kitchen before breakfast, which was unusual enough that she looked up immediately. He was holding a letter, and something in the way he was holding it told her before he spoke that it was good news, and she felt the relief of that pass through her so quickly she almost missed it. Hollis will review the Caldwell assessment and testify to his findings, William said. He's reviewed the documents I sent him, and he has preliminary concerns about the methodology. He'll have a full written analysis by the first week of September. She breathed out. How preliminary are the concerns? He wrote. William looked at the letter. The comparable properties used to establish the Harper Bakery valuation were selected in a manner inconsistent with standard practice and appear to systematically understate the property's market value. She looked at him. Systematically understate. That's what he wrote. She was quiet for a moment. If Caldwell had undervalued the property, it meant the collateral securing the loan was worth more than the loan itself, which changed the risk picture entirely, which was exactly the kind of thing that should have been disclosed, which hadn't been, which was exactly the question of process that Voss had said could challenge the enforceability of the loan terms. That's enough, she said. That's what we needed. It might be enough, William said, with the precision of a man who didn't oversell things. It depends on the judge. I know. She looked at him steadily. Thank you. For Hollis. Hollis did the work, he said. Thank him. She would, later. Right now, she had breakfast for 47 men to get on the table and 2 weeks until a hearing that was going to determine whether everything she'd been building since February had anywhere to land. She got to work. The days before the hearing had a particular quality, like the weather before a large storm, when the air pressure changes and everything becomes slightly more vivid and slightly more charged. She kept to her routines because routines were what kept her functional. Breakfast at 5:30, dinner at 6, supply orders on Wednesday, weekly menu on Sunday evenings. But underneath the routines, her mind was running continuously. She went through the documents at night, sitting at the small desk in her room at the ranch, after the kitchen was clean and the house was quiet. The original loan agreement, Voss's filings, the counterclaim, the supplementary action notice, Hollis's preliminary letter. She read them in order and in pieces and in combinations, trying to understand the shape of the case from every angle, trying to find the places where Whitmore's lawyers would push and make sure Voss was ready for the push. She wrote Voss a list of questions. He wrote back with answers that were sometimes reassuring and sometimes the honest version of "I don't know," which she respected more than false reassurance. William found her in the kitchen at 11 o'clock on the Sunday before the hearing, still going through documents at the work table with a cup of cold tea at her elbow. He stood in the doorway and looked at her for a moment. You should sleep, he said. I know. Knowing and doing are different things, yes. She looked up at him. He was still dressed, which meant he'd been working at something too. You're not sleeping either. He was quiet. Sit down, she said. There's tea, though it's gone cold. He sat down across the table from her. The first time he'd actually sat in this kitchen, she realized. He was always in the doorway. She wasn't sure what to make of him sitting down, so she made nothing of it and poured him cold tea and went back to the document she'd been reading. They sat in silence for a few minutes, the kind of silence that had its own texture. Not empty, but full of things that didn't need to be said. My wife, he said finally, not looking at the documents, looking at the table. She was someone who fought for things, not loud about it. Just, she decided what mattered, and she went after it, and she didn't stop. I used to watch her and think I'd never seen anything like it. Evelyn kept her eyes on the document she was holding, giving him the privacy of not being looked at while he said it. She would have liked you, he said. I think she would have understood you. She set the document down, looked at him. Thank you, she said, for telling me that. He nodded once and drank the cold tea, and they sat in the quiet kitchen for a little while longer, and then she closed the folder and said she was going to sleep. And she did. Better than she had in days, for reasons she didn't examine too closely. The hearing was on a Thursday. She rode to Cheyenne with William on Wednesday afternoon. He'd insisted, and she'd accepted without argument because she'd learned which arguments were worth having, and this wasn't one of them. Voss met them at the hotel where they'd arranged to stay, and they spent 2 hours going through the final preparation. Hollis's written analysis had arrived by post on Monday. It was 14 pages. Voss had summarized it for her, but she'd read all 14 pages herself, twice, until she could have narrated the key findings from memory. Caldwell had used comparable properties from the south side of Ravenwood, a commercial district that had been declining for 3 years, to establish the market value of a bakery on Mill Street, which sat in a corridor that had been growing. The undervaluation was not marginal, it was significant. When Whitmore's lawyers push on the independence question, she said to Voss during the preparation session, they're going to argue that Caldwell's relationship with the trading company was disclosed in the loan documents. Was it? Voss looked at her over his glasses. Where did you find that? Page 4, she said. There's a line about the assessment being conducted by an independent firm. The word independent is used. Caldwell is not named. Voss was quiet for a moment. Yes, that's what they'll argue, that your father signed a document that disclosed the assessment methodology. My father didn't know who Caldwell was or what his relationship with Whitmore was. The word independent was there. He had no reason to question it. That's our argument, Voss said, that the disclosure was insufficient to constitute informed consent because the nature of the conflict wasn't specifically disclosed. Will that hold? In front of this particular judge, Voss considered. Judge Alderman is 58 years old. He's been on the territorial bench for 11 years. He does not like sloppy process, and he does not like men who use legal documents to do indirectly what they can't do directly. He paused. I think it holds. She slept that night with the same uneasy negotiation as always, but she slept. The courthouse in Cheyenne was a solid brick building on the main street, wide-windowed, smelling of old wood and document storage and the particular institutional quiet of a place where serious things happened and were expected to continue happening. They arrived early. Voss had papers organized in a leather satchel. Hollis was already there, a compact, precise man in his late 50s with the look of someone who spent his professional life making accurate measurements and expected the same accuracy from the world in return. Whitmore's lawyers arrived 8 minutes before the hearing was called. There were 2 of them, a senior man in an expensive suit whose name she'd seen on the counterfiling, Beaumont, and a younger associate who carried the documents and said nothing. Beaumont was the kind of lawyer who wore his confidence like a coat, visible from across the room. Whitmore himself arrived last. She saw him come in and take a seat on the far side of the room, and she watched him the way she'd watched him through the pass-through in William's front room 6 weeks ago, looking for what his face gave away, tracking the calculation behind the pleasant smoothness. He looked at her once. She held his gaze for exactly the amount of time it took to make clear that she wasn't going to be the one to look away. And then she looked at Voss's documents and did not look at Whitmore again. Judge Alderman came in. He was exactly as Voss had described, a plain-faced man with heavy eyebrows and the unhurried manner of someone who had seen a great many cases and was not going to be rushed through this one. He looked at the room, looked at the parties, opened his notes. This is a contested foreclosure proceeding, he said. I've reviewed the filings from both parties. We'll start with the procedural challenge to the original loan terms. Mr. Voss. Voss stood. He was good. She'd known he was competent, but watching him in the courtroom, she understood why William had trusted his name. He was precise without being cold, clear without being simple, and he built the argument the way she built a complex meal, one component at a time, each one tasting right on its own but pointing toward the whole. The valuation conflict, Caldwell's relationship with the Whitmore Trading Company, the inadequacy of the disclosure in the loan document, the gap between the properties Caldwell used as comparables and the actual market position of the Harper Bakery. Then Hollis. He stood and testified for 40 minutes. I was the most boring witness she'd ever heard, and she meant that as the highest possible compliment. He presented 14 pages of analysis in a voice that made every finding sound like arithmetic, like the simple and inevitable result of applying proper methodology to available data. There was no drama in it. There didn't need to be. The findings were dramatic enough. In your professional opinion, Voss said at the end, Does the Caldwell assessment reflect an independent valuation of the Harper property? No, Hollis said. It reflects a valuation produced by a methodology that systematically favored an outcome consistent with the interests of the party holding the loan. Beaumont objected. The judge considered. The objection was overruled. Beaumont's cross-examination of Hollis was competent, and Hollis withstood it completely. Because a man who has spent 15 years making accurate measurements in a territory where land fraud is a persistent problem has heard every challenge to his methodology and has his answers ready. Then it was Beaumont's turn. He argued that Thomas Harper had signed the loan document and was therefore bound by its terms regardless of the disclosure's specificity. He argued that Caldwell's relationship with the Whitmore Trading Company was a matter of public commercial record that any borrower conducting due diligence could have discovered. He argued that the counterclaim's doubled figure accurately reflected accumulated interest and legal costs and was legitimately owed. The arguments were not bad. She sat with her hands folded on the table in front of her and listened, and did not move. Then something happened that she hadn't known was coming. Voss stood up. "Your Honor," he said, "I'd like to enter one additional item into the record with the court's permission." The judge looked at him. "What item?" "A letter," Voss said. "Written by Thomas Harper on January 27th of this year to Marcus Whitmore, requesting a meeting to discuss the loan renewal terms. The letter was never responded to. Thomas Harper died 11 days after writing it. The letter was found among his personal correspondence by his daughter and has been authenticated by the county notary. She had given Voss that letter 3 weeks ago. She had found it in the desk at the bakery on her second visit, tucked into the back of the bottom drawer. Her father's handwriting on his good stationery, formal, respectful, asking for a meeting with the reasonable man he believed Whitmore to be. She'd nearly missed it. Beaumont objected immediately. Voss was ready. The argument went back and forth for 4 minutes, and at the end of it the judge admitted the letter into evidence and read it in full, and the courtroom was very quiet while he read. She watched Whitmore's face. The pleasant smoothness was still there, but something underneath it had shifted. She could see it, the slight tightening around the jaw, the careful stillness of a man controlling a reaction he hadn't expected to need to control. Her father had written the letter. He had tried. He had tried 11 days before he died, with the decent courtesy of a man who believed in giving people a chance to do the right thing, and Marcus Whitmore had never responded. And Thomas Harper had died with that unanswered request in the room, and Marcus Whitmore had moved on his property 4 months later as if the letter had never existed. It existed now. It existed in the record of a territorial court in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and Judge Alderman was reading it with the heavy eyebrowed attention of a man who did not like sloppy process and did not like men who used legal documents to do indirectly what they couldn't do directly. The judge set the letter down. He looked at the room for a moment in a way that told you nothing specific and everything general about which direction his thinking was running. "We'll recess for 1 hour," he said. "I'll have a preliminary ruling this afternoon." She went outside during the recess. William found her on the courthouse steps, standing in the September air, which had the first cool edge of the coming autumn in it. That particular smell of Wyoming in early fall, dry grass and distance, and something that was not quite wind but was the promise of it. "How do you think it went?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "The letter," he said. "I didn't know about the letter. I found it late. I wasn't sure Voss could use it." The judge read it twice. She had noticed that too. They stood on the courthouse steps and waited for the hour to pass, and she thought about her father writing that letter at his desk on a Sunday evening in January, by lamplight, in his careful handwriting, asking Marcus Whitmore for a reasonable conversation. She thought about the man who had believed in people in the world that had taken advantage of that belief. She thought about what she was going to do with whatever came next. The hour passed. They went back inside. Judge Alderman came in without preamble and sat and opened his notes and looked at the room. "In the matter of the procedural challenge to the foreclosure action on the Harper property," he said, "I find the following. The valuation methodology employed by the Caldwell firm presents sufficient questions of process, independence, to warrant setting aside the collateral determination as established at the time of the original loan. A new, independent assessment of the Harper property will be commissioned by the court. Foreclosure proceedings are stayed pending completion of that assessment and a new hearing on the revised terms." The counterclaim doubled figure. She waited. Regarding the counterclaim for accumulated interest and legal costs, he said, I find that the acceleration of the debt cannot be properly adjudicated until the underlying collateral question is resolved. The counterclaim is held pending the new assessment. He looked up from his notes. I will also note for the record that the letter entered into evidence by Mr. Voss raises questions about the response practices of the lending party during the period preceding the borrower's death. Those questions are not within the scope of today's proceeding, but they are in the record and may inform future proceedings. He closed his notes. It was not a complete victory. She'd understood going in that a complete victory in one hearing was unlikely. But the foreclosure was stayed. The Caldwell assessment was thrown out. The counterclaim was on hold. And in the record of the Court of Wyoming Territory sat her father's letter and the judge's note about the questions it raised. Whitmore would not be getting the bakery on Mill Street today. She stood when the judge left the room, and she was careful to stand steadily because her legs had decided to express an opinion about the morning that the rest of her wasn't quite ready to have publicly. Voss was already organizing his papers. William was to her left, and she could feel him there without looking, the particular solid presence of him. Beaumont and his associate gathered their materials on the far side of the room. Whitmore stood and put on his hat and looked across the room at her. She looked back. His face gave nothing away. The pleasant smoothness was back in place, the calculation running behind it, already moving to the next step the way men like him always moved. Because men like him didn't stop when they lost a round, they adjusted and they came back, and she knew that, and she wasn't finished knowing it. But he looked at her for a moment, just a moment, with something different underneath the smoothness, something she'd seen once before, through the kitchen pass-through, when William had said that's for a court to determine and caught him unprepared. Something that looked, just briefly, like the recognition of a woman he'd underestimated. She held his gaze until he looked away. Then she picked up her things, thanked Edmund Voss with the directness he deserved, shook Garrett Hollis's hand and meant it, and walked out of the courthouse into the September afternoon with William Sterling beside her, and the cool Wyoming air against her face, and the knowledge that the fight was not over but the ground had shifted, and this time it had shifted in her direction. She had not won, but she had made something that mattered. She had made it visible. The ride back from Cheyenne was quiet in the way that follows something large. Not uncomfortable, just the natural quiet of two people who had been holding themselves at a particular pitch of readiness for hours and were now, slowly, letting that go. The road ran northwest through grassland that was turning with the season, the green of summer giving way at the edges to the dry gold of early fall. And the sky above it was the wide, clean blue that Wyoming produced in September, like it was the only thing it knew how to do right. William rode on her left. Neither of them spoke much for the first hour. She was thinking about the judge's words. Foreclosure proceedings are stayed. She was thinking about what stayed meant in practical terms. Not finished, not resolved, but halted. Breathing room created where there had been none. The door she'd been pushing against giving just enough that she could get a foot in it. She was thinking about the letter. Her father's letter, in the court record now, permanent, witnessed, real, in a way that no amount of Marcus Whitmore's smooth pleasantness could undo. Thomas Harper had tried. He had been a decent man who had tried to do the right thing by a man who had never intended to do the right thing by him, and that was in the record now, and the record didn't forget. "You're thinking about your father," William said. She glanced at him. "How do you know?" "Your face is doing something specific." He said it simply, not unkindly. "It does a different thing when you're running numbers versus when you're somewhere else." She looked at the road. He would have hated today. All of it. The courtroom, the formality, the adversarial machinery of it. He believed things should be workable between reasonable people. He wasn't wrong that they should be, William said. He was wrong about Whitmore being a reasonable person. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "I used to think that was a flaw. His willingness to extend good faith too long, too wide. I thought it made him naive. And now?" She considered. The grass moved alongside the road, the wind coming down from the north with the cool edge that meant the season was genuinely turning. "Now I think it was just who he was. It cost him. But it was also the thing that made people trust him for 23 years. The same quality that let Whitmore take advantage of him was the quality that made the Dunmore brothers drive out to the ranch on a Sunday to drink coffee and tell me they hadn't forgotten." William didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "That's a fair accounting." It's the honest one, she said. I've had a lot of time to think about it. They rode in silence for a while after that, and it was the comfortable kind. The kind that had developed between them over months of early mornings and kitchen doorways and late evenings going through documents. The kind that didn't need to be filled. She didn't know exactly what to call what existed between her and William Sterling. She knew what it was in practical terms. An employer and an employee. A man who had made a decision at a market and a woman who had been smart enough to say yes to it. She knew what it had become in the day-to-day. Something built out of shared purpose and mutual directness, and the particular intimacy of two people who had both lost people they loved and had stopped pretending that didn't shape everything. She hadn't said any of this out loud. Neither had he. She wasn't sure this was the moment for it, with Whitmore's next move still unplayed and the court's new assessment still pending and the second hearing somewhere in the future. There was too much unfinished between her and the world to also try to figure out what was happening between her and this man. But she was aware of it. She'd stopped pretending she wasn't. The court-commissioned assessment of the Harper Bakery property came back in the third week of October. The assessor was a woman named Ruth Bancroft, the first woman property assessor in Wyoming Territory, a fact that Voss had mentioned in passing and that Evelyn found privately significant without making anything of it. Ruth Bancroft was 51 years old, had been doing this work for 18 years, and had the precise, unsentimental manner of someone who had spent 2 decades making sure her numbers were unimpeachable because she knew exactly how much people would want to impeach them. Her assessment of the bakery on Mill Street came in at 40% higher than Caldwell's. 40%. She sat with that number for a long time when Voss's letter arrived with the findings. 40% higher meant the collateral had never been underwater. 40% higher meant the property had always been worth more than the loan. 40% higher meant that the entire framework Marcus Whitmore had built, the narrow acceleration clause, the convenient delinquency, the foreclosure filing, had been constructed on a foundation that a proper assessment would have made legally untenable from the start. He had known. She had suspected it, and William had implied it, and Voss had built the argument around the possibility of it, but seeing the number made it certain. Marcus Whitmore had known the property was worth more than he'd allowed it to be assessed at, and he had used that gap as the mechanism to eventually take it. The second hearing was set for November. Between October and November, 2 things happened. The first was that Marcus Whitmore made an offer. It came through Beaumont, the senior lawyer, delivered in a letter to Voss that was worded with the careful neutrality of a document written by someone who knew it might eventually be read in a courtroom. The offer was simple. Whitmore would drop the counterclaim entirely and release the supplementary action on the property if Evelyn agreed to a negotiated settlement of the original debt at the pre-renewal terms, with a 5-year repayment schedule at the original interest rate. It was, objectively, a reasonable offer. It was the offer he should have made to her father in January, before the renewal notice, before the acceleration, before all of it. It was what a reasonable man would have offered in the first place. And the fact that he was offering it now, after a court had thrown out his assessment and a second hearing was coming, told her everything she needed to know about why he was offering it. He was afraid of November. She thought about it for 2 days. She was honest with herself about the thinking, ran it cleanly, without letting pride make the decision or exhaustion make it. The settlement would end the legal fight. It would give her the bakery back on manageable terms. It would let her stop spending money on this battle and start building with what she had. It was also a way for Marcus Whitmore to close the door on public scrutiny of what he'd done. No second hearing meant no more of the record being built. No more of the judge's noted questions about response practices during the period preceding Thomas Harper's death. No more of the accumulating documentation of how a private loan had been structured and timed and executed in a way that a reasonable person might call something other than an honest business arrangement. She thought about her father's letter in the court record. She thought about the Dunmore brothers on a Sunday afternoon. She thought about Mrs. Garland and what Danny had reported of her language regarding Marcus Whitmore. She thought about the women who had walked past her table at the market, and the ones who hadn't, and the difference between the two, which was not really about bread at all. She wrote to Voss. She told him she would accept the settlement on one condition, that Whitmore provide a written acknowledgement for the court record that the Caldwell assessment had been conducted under a conflict of interest, and that the original loan terms had been structured in a manner that failed to meet standards of fair dealing. Voss wrote back to say that Whitmore's lawyers would never agree to that. She wrote back to say she knew. The second hearing happened on a Tuesday in mid-November, with the first real cold of the season sitting in the Cheyenne air and the courthouse smelling of coal fires and the particular tension of a room that knew something was going to be decided. Ruth Bancroft testified. She was extraordinarily boring and completely devastating, in the same way Hollis had been, because the truth delivered in a flat, precise voice by someone who has been measuring things accurately for 18 years carries a weight that no amount of legal argument can redistribute. 40% undervaluation, documented methodology. Clear departure from standard comparable selection practice, Beaumont argued. He was good. He'd had 6 weeks to prepare, and he came in with a more refined version of the independence argument, a more detailed challenge to the comparable methodology, a more careful framing of the disclosure issue. Judge Alderman listened to all of it with his heavy eyebrowed attention and the unhurried manner of a man who had decided he was going to understand this fully before he ruled on it. Then he ruled. The original collateral assessment was formally set aside. The loan terms as written were unenforceable under the flawed collateral determination. The foreclosure action was dismissed. The counterclaim was dismissed. The supplementary action on the property was released. Marcus Whitmore was entitled to repayment of the original principal at the original interest rate, under terms to be negotiated in good faith between the parties, with a court-appointed mediator if the parties could not reach an agreement independently. He got his money back. He did not get the bakery. She heard the ruling and she sat very still for a moment, and then she looked at Voss, who was gathering his papers with the controlled expression of a man who had expected this outcome and was being professional about his relief. And she looked at William, who was beside her in the same way he had been beside her in September, steady and present. And she felt something move through her that she couldn't entirely name. Not triumph. It wasn't clean enough for triumph. The fight had cost too much and taken too long, and her father was still gone, and none of this brought him back or made up for what Marcus Whitmore had tried to do. There was no version of this that was a clean win. But Whitmore had not gotten what he came for. And her father's letter was in the record of the Court of Wyoming Territory. And the bakery on Mill Street, with its slightly uneven sign above the counter, was still hers. She looked across the room at Marcus Whitmore. I was already talking quietly with Beaumont, his hat in his hands in that studied courtesy posture she recognized, his face showing nothing specific. He didn't look at her. She decided she didn't need him to. She had spent months needing things from people who had no intention of giving them. Marcus Whitmore's good faith, Ravenwood's recognition, the market crowd's attention. She'd learned, slowly and at some cost, that needing things from people who wouldn't give them was a way of handing control of your life to the wrong hands. You could want people to be reasonable. You could want them to see you clearly, but you couldn't build anything on the wanting. You built on what you did with your own hands. She stood up and thanked Voss and shook Hollis's hand and walked out of the courthouse. She and William arranged repayment of the original loan directly with Whitmore's lawyers the following week, through Voss's office. The negotiation took 2 hours and was conducted in the flat, formal language of a business transaction, which was what it was. She signed the repayment agreement with the same steady hands she'd used to stand at the market table all day and to reorganize Sterling Ranch's disaster of a kitchen and to hold those original loan documents in the lamplight of her father's bakery while she understood for the first time the shape of what had been done to her family. When it was done, Whitmore's lawyers left. She and Voss sat in his office for a few minutes in the quiet. You know, Voss said, setting down his pen, most people in your position would have taken the settlement in October. I know, she said. It would have been the rational choice. It would have let him close the door on the record, she said. The judge's note about his response practices is in that record permanently now. Other people who've done business with Marcus Whitmore can find it. Other people who might do business with him in the future might find it. She paused. My father couldn't warn anyone. I could. Voss looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite read. You understand that note may never lead to anything. I understand that, she said. It still needed to be there. She opened Harper's Bakery on a Monday morning in the first week of December. Not with ceremony. She'd specifically avoided ceremony, because ceremony required an audience, and she was done performing for audiences, done needing the crowd to stop, or the town to acknowledge, or anyone to validate the decision she'd made to keep going. She opened because she was ready to open, because the kitchen was restocked and the ovens were working, and she had a recipe for cardamom cinnamon apple pie that her mother had left her, and a list of bread orders she'd already taken from the Dunmore brothers and Mrs. Garland and a few others who had heard she was coming back. She built the fires before dawn, the way her father had taught her. The sign above the counter was still slightly uneven. She'd thought about getting it repainted, with the letters straighter, more professional. She'd decided against it. The uneven letters were her father's work, his stubborn attempt at something he wasn't particularly good at, the evidence of a man who tried things anyway. She didn't want them straight. The first customer came in at 7:15. It was Danny, who had ridden all the way from Sterling Ranch in the December cold, specifically to be the first one through the door, which she suspected had something to do with William, and something to do with the 19-year-old's genuine sweetness, and something to do with the fact that he had decided, somewhere in the course of the past months, that he was invested in this particular outcome. He bought 3 cinnamon rolls and a loaf of bread, and paid more than the listed price, and told her the change was for the next customer who couldn't afford the full amount. She looked at him for a moment. "That's very decent of you, Danny," she said. He turned red and left quickly, and she stood behind the counter in her father's bakery with the sign above her head and the fires going in the ovens and the smell of bread and cardamom filling the space, and she let herself feel it. Just for a moment, just privately, before the next customer came. This was what her father had spent 23 years building, not the physical space. The physical space was just wood and stone and glass. The thing he had actually built was a place where people came and felt welcomed and went home with something that made their day slightly better. That was the whole project. That was what Marcus Whitmore had tried to take, not because he needed it, but because he could. Because he looked at a young woman standing alone at the end of a market row and saw something that wouldn't fight back. He'd been wrong. She'd been standing alone, but alone had turned out not to mean what she'd thought it meant, or what he'd thought it meant. Alone had turned out to mean not yet found the people who were coming, not yet arrived at the version of things where the Dunmore brothers showed up on a Sunday, and the foreman of a 40,000-acre ranch came to drink cold tea in the kitchen at 11 at night, and a 19-year-old boy rode through December cold to be the first person through the door. You could be alone in the middle of the crowd at the market, and not alone at all in the kitchen of a man who saw something nobody else noticed. That was the thing nobody told you, not about resilience. She was tired of stories about resilience, which made it sound like the point was to survive, as if survival were the destination rather than just the precondition. The thing nobody told you was that the fight itself changed you, not always in ways you chose, but in ways that were real. She was not the same woman who had stood in this bakery in June, reading a foreclosure notice with steady hands and a tight jaw. She was harder in some places and less defended in others, and she knew things about herself she hadn't known then. What she could carry, where her limits were, which fears she could work through, and which ones she just had to walk alongside. She knew she couldn't do everything alone. That had been the hardest thing to learn. Harder than the kitchen organization, harder than the legal documents, harder than standing her ground with Hicks or in a Cheyenne courtroom. The belief that needing help was the same thing as weakness was a belief she'd carried without knowing she carried it, and it had taken William Sterling standing in a kitchen doorway at 11 at night to show her that it was wrong. William came to the bakery on the second day it was open. He came in the mid-morning, the quiet hour, when the breakfast rush had settled and the lunch orders hadn't started. He stood in the doorway for a moment, that doorway posture, always that posture, and looked at the space with the expression of a man taking in something he wanted to see clearly. She poured him coffee and set a cinnamon roll on the counter. He sat down, the same way he'd sat down in the kitchen at the ranch, without making a production of it, just choosing to be in the space rather than at the edge of it. They talked for an hour. Not about the hearing or the legal settlement or the ranch operations. Not about anything that had been demanding their attention for months. They talked the way people talk when the immediate emergency has passed and they are figuring out what's left when the noise goes quiet. About his wife, a little. About her mother. About what it meant to build something and lose it and build again with the scar of the first loss still there. About whether Wyoming was getting too settled or not settled enough. About the price of cattle and the price of flour, and whether the winter was going to come hard or gentle. About nothing and everything in the way of people who have earned the right to waste a little time together. "I want to ask you something," he said at the end of the hour, with his coffee finished and the cinnamon roll long gone. She looked at him. I've been thinking about expanding the ranch operation. Not the cattle, the hospitality side. Travelers coming through, people making the Cheyenne run, who need somewhere to stop that isn't a rough bunkhouse. A proper dining arrangement. Good food. He paused. I'd want someone to run it who knows what they're doing. She was quiet for a moment. You already have someone running your kitchen. I have someone running my kitchen who also has her own bakery to run, he said. I'm not asking you to choose. I'm asking whether there's a way to do both. She thought about what it would mean, the expanded operation, the arrangement between the bakery and the ranch, the continued presence at Sterling in a more permanent capacity, about what it would mean beyond the professional question, which she didn't say but which was sitting in the room with them the way honest things sit in rooms when the people involved are being careful about the pace. I'd need to think about it, she said. I know, he said. And I'd need it in writing, she said. Terms, compensation, arrangement for the bakery operation to continue independently. Of course, he said. And I'd need you to stop standing in doorways, she said. It's a strange habit. He looked at her for a moment, and then he did something she hadn't seen before was. He laughed, short and genuine, the laugh of someone who has been caught in something true. I've been told that before, he said. By whom? By my wife. He said it without the careful flatness she'd heard before. More plainly, the way you say something when you've stopped protecting the wound and started carrying it differently. She said I stood in doorways like a man deciding whether to commit to being in the room. She was right, Evelyn said. She usually was, he said. They sat in that for a moment, the two of them in the quiet bakery with the winter light coming through the front window, and the fires doing their work in the ovens, and the smell of bread making the air feel warmer than it was. There was no dramatic declaration, no moment of arrival. There was just this, a woman who had fought for something and won enough of it to stand on, and a man who had seen her clearly from the beginning, and the ordinary morning light of a December in Wyoming making everything sharp-edged and real. She reached across the counter and refilled his coffee. He didn't say thank you. He just wrapped his hands around the cup the way you wrap your hands around warmth when you've been cold for a while. Outside, Ravenwood went about its business in the particular way of small frontier towns. Wagons and horses and the distant sound of the lumber yard and women walking with baskets and children running between legs like water. The same town that had walked past her table in June. The same town that had whispered about Thomas Harper's girl wasting her time. It was the same town. She was not the same woman. That was the thing about being pushed to the edge of what you could manage. It showed you the edge. And knowing where your edge was, knowing you'd stood there and not gone over, changed the way you stood everywhere else. Not with arrogance. Arrogance was what Whitmore had, the absolute certainty of a man who believed the rules bent for him. What Evelyn had was different. It was the quiet knowledge of someone who had tested herself under real conditions and found out she was still there on the other side. Her father had believed in the basic decency of people, and he had been taken advantage of for it, and she had loved him and missed him every day and intended to carry his belief forward in the only way that made sense to her, not as naivety, not as an invitation to exploitation, but as a standard she held herself to. She would extend good faith to people who earned it. She would build things that were worth building. She would not let the existence of Marcus Whitmore in the world make her into someone who assumed the worst of everyone. That was the inheritance she'd chosen to take. Harper's Bakery would stay open. The sign with its slightly uneven letters would stay the way it was. The cardamom cinnamon recipe would keep going as long as she was alive to make it, and after that she intended to write it down more carefully than her mother had, with full instructions, leaving nothing for interpretation, so that whoever came next would have what they needed. She was 23 years old, she had a bakery and an arrangement to discuss, and a father she had done right by, and a winter ahead that was going to require everything she had, the way winters always did. She wasn't invisible. She never had been. She had just been waiting, without knowing she was waiting, for the conditions that would make her visible to herself. And the rest, the town, the crowd, the world that had walked past her table, and the world that had eventually come back, the rest could catch up at whatever pace it mattered.